The 1950s, I think, has a public persona in historical writing as one in which students were not politically active. And I think this is seen through the lens of activism in the 1960s. And although there's some truth in that, I would want to argue that on certain types of issue, Melbourne students were very active and were very progressive as against students in other universities around the country. I would say this particularly about matters relating to race and ethnicity and the immigration policy. Kate has mentioned that Stephen Charles and I became office bearers in the Students' Representative Council in 1958-59, and we walked into what had become a tradition amongst Melbourne University students of protesting against the White Australia policy. This is just part of a wider sensibility at Melbourne, which I would track back to Professor McMahon Ball in his position as Professor of Political Science, the inaugural one, who'd held all sorts of positions in government during the war and after it, which brought him in touch with Ailsa, and he was a pioneer in arguing for Australian-Asian relations. And this came through in his teaching to his students. Students like Herb Feith, who became the founding volunteer graduate in the volunteer graduate scheme for Indonesia. People like Jim Webb, who became very prominent in other things, was warden of the Union later on, but also in community aid abroad and other organisations with an Asian connection. He was the secretary to Sam Dimmick in the SRC. And later generations, through our immediate predecessor, Howard Nathan, here was secretary. There had been in 1955 referenda. Melbourne tried hard to press NUAUS to adopt a condemnation of this. Again, it happened in Howard's time, and we pursued it as well at NUAUS Council and Executive Meeting in 1959. Now, other universities was like a Mason-Dixon line. North of the Murray, they were largely opposed to this. They took the line that NUAUS and their own student organisation should only take a position on things that affected students as students. So the line went. And this was not one such thing, they said. The University of Queensland Union's delegate, Nick Clark, son of the economist Colin Clark, threatened that the University of Queensland Union would secede from NUAUS if it was even discussed. The support that Melbourne got tended to be from the southern universities, from Western Australia and Adelaide, each of which had Asian students among their delegates, and from Tasmania. Now, one of the things that contributed to all of this was the presence of Asian students on campus. There were about 400 Asian students at Melbourne University at the time of the control or colour bar, and there had been quite a lot similarly since the early 1950s as a result of the Colombo Plan. Another SRC president that I've mentioned, Sam Dimmick, was an initiator with a couple of Asian students of the time of the idea of having an international student hostel, and that led to an appeal which produced International House at Melbourne, the first such international college in any Australian university. Students were very active in delegations travelling to other countries, visiting other student organisations, and discovering that the White Australia policy was one of the earliest things that was thrown in their faces at that time.
Almost all the people who signed the original control or colour bar document were not students, they were graduates. And that's very significant. In other words, the background of the student movement was enormously important because that set the scene. That produced the people like Stephen and Howard, who then graduated and came into what was effectively a graduate movement. If you look at the membership, it's almost entirely. It's not a student movement as such, it's a graduate movement. And it had people who had travelled and so on. It's also very important because it came together to write a reasoned, intellectual, thoughtful, moderate piece which analysed immigration policy generally. It was to be as concise as possible, but it was to be accurate, and it was designed to persuade people about the reasonableness of the case. And that was very significant, and that was where the leadership of people like Jamie Mackey and Ken Rivett was important. But it was a study group. It so describes itself in Control or Colour Bar. And that was a new phenomenon in a way. And it's even a new phenomenon in our present day. If I ask myself, what would happen if we were addressing the issue today? You would have protests, you would take to the streets, you would have people agitating, you would have 30-second grabs on television or on sound radio. You wouldn't have an opportunity to put a reasoned case the way we did in about 40 pages of close thought. And it was that we were seeking to do, and it was that really swung it, because it carried a lot of the people in the political parties who were fundamentally, supporters of abolishing white Australia policy, but needed a reasoned case and a moderate case to do so. And this was a very, very important breakthrough. It was quite different from anything that had preceded it, and in a sense, it was a unique phenomenon, which I don't think we would see again today. We'd all become so much more prisoners of the urgent media, of the whole multimedia mix and so on. So it was great to be able to go to these meetings, go carefully through the papers, and also we had amongst our members people like Tony Harold, who was a solicitor in a rather conservative firm, oddly enough, Ryler and Ryler, but he acted for a lot of people who were seeking relief from being deported under the existing immigration. And we all became quite informed about these cases. So we were not only thoughtful and informed about the racist issue, we were also very informed about how immigration policies were working. And some of the things that we say in Control or Colour Bar were totally enlightened by the standards of what followed, because it was saying things that weren't said again until the 1980s.
I can recall my first foray into student politics was in fact in support of white Australia. And that was when I first arrived, and I'd been here 2 days or something. And then I got exposed to the university itself. And within weeks I had dismounted from that position by virtue of being exposed to at least some people of colour, including, let me tell you, terribly influenced by Ailsa. She mightn't even know that. But I can say this, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of everybody, what happened is that we became outraged at the immorality of the position. It was very largely a movement driven by moral concern, rather than political concern or good relations with Asia or trade opportunities, anything of that kind. I think it's really fair to say that Jamie, and particularly Ken Rivett, were leaders in taking us to a position that it was simply disgraceful to discriminate on the basis of colour and race.
At school, we used the textbook ourselves in the Pacific, so it's a myth to think that schools in those days did not educate you about Asia. We certainly had a good dose. And Norman Harper, another important figure at Melbourne University, Professor of American History, but at Melbourne High he came often as a visiting speaker, and he always talked about Asia. And he often spoke to the Australian-Indonesian Association about events. He was well up on Indonesia, Asia. He was a remarkable man, and he had an impact too on us. And I don't think we can underestimate the effect of the Colombo Plan students. They were from all of Southeast Asia. They were superb people, really quality young men and women. And they gave us a tremendous lift in our community because invariably they lived with landladies. So the Australian-Indonesian Association had this incredible collection of people at it. It had academics, top academics from the university, but there's an enormous collection of landladies and their husbands. And they came to love their guests, their people, their boarders they'd have, and that changed their attitudes. And they were very ordinary people. And I think that had a tremendous impact.
University, like Ananda Krishnan, for example, who everyone around the university knew at the time. He was regularly being quoted in Farrago and complaining about the fact that whenever he went back to Asia, he was immediately attacked on all sides by, what are you doing in that terrible racist country? I've always been surprised that Gough Whitlam has been given the credit for ending the White Australia policy. It really had ended by 1971 when 10,000 a year were coming in. Gough made the great proclamation that it had ended, but then fell at the first hurdle because he didn't want any Vietnamese coming here. And I can give chapter and verse on that. The second is that the end of the White Australia policy changed my life because thanks to its removal, I now have 2 Vietnamese children.
I mean, was it a turning point? Did it shape later action and activity? It certainly seems from looking at your biographies it did, but I'm just trying to gauge that kind of level of significance. So
I think it led us into all sorts of other bodies where we carried these ideas more widely. The only thing that struck me after rereading it, and I haven't reread it for many years, was how reasoned it is on issues other than race. For example, it talks about assimilation. Now, assimilation at the time, the policy of settlement at the time was that if you were unrecognisably Aussie, you were a great success as a migrant. Now, we've abandoned all that now, but it took a long time. But we were saying that. We were saying that in This Control or Colour Bar in 1959-60. We didn't start saying that until about 1989 when we published the National Agenda. In the meantime, the test was always, as it were, if you're settled in so that you became invisible, you were a successful migrant. And we didn't understand and make it an actual part of the policy, which it became in the National Agenda, an idea that you tested immigration on far more than economic viability, on far more than obvious integration. And it's no coincidence that this short reasoned case, which went into that, wasn't really carried through. I don't know of any publications like it for the next 20 or 30 years until we came to the National Agenda, which I had the good fortune to be the chairman of the Multicultural Affairs Council. And we reduced multiculturalism to quite a short publication when it was launched. And it just showed you that if you did the work and you did it thoughtfully and reasonably and not emotively, there was a great chance of success. And there'd been an enormous amount of waffle talked about multiculturalism for 20 years. The National Agenda put all that into much more reasoned language. And I think that, in a way, it was a successor to Control or Colour Bar. And there are other things in Control or Colour Bar about services, for example. It talks about the need to provide true services for immigrants so that it improves their settlement prospects. Now that was, years before its time. It wasn't until the Galbally report, which was in Fraser's period of office, that there was a wholesale investigation about the provision of services for migrants. So in a way, I think it is an extraordinary document, which it's a pity hadn't had sufficient use and sufficient examination. So I hope that this seminar will cause people to go back and see that as a recipe for changing public opinion, perhaps we ought to go back to reason documentation and abandon the 30-second quip and all the rest of it.
The abolition of white Australia was not an idea that time had come and this book pushed it. It was incremental, but to me it did establish the proposition that Fabianism did work on the basis of reason and relatively polite civil interchange, so that really did become a yardstick as far as I was concerned in other matters of reform. My terrible regret is that I don't think it's possible that that can occur now. It's the moment of the shriek and the scream and the 50-second grab, and civil discourse seems to have disappeared, and reasoned argument over time seems to have disappeared. So I lament where we're at, but I'm rather pleased with where we came from.